After the death of Richard "Peg-leg" Lonergan in the Adonis Social Club, Maddie Martin was now the presumed leader of the gang. Martin had married Anna Lonergan a few months after the death of her previous husband, Wild Bill Lovett. Maddie Martin had been part of Bill Lovett's faction of the White Hand Gang. Martin and two others, William Kelly and Matthew Trinder, had been held on suspicion of the murder of John Travers in May 1924, but all were released due to lack of evidence. Police believed that John Travers had been shot as part of the internal gang war between the rival factions. Travers had been shot 6 times at the corner of John and Jay Streets. He was 3 times in the abdomen, twice in the left side of his body and once in the back. Police found a fully loaded revolver at the scene, which Travers said was not his, and they found another revolver, which had been emptied, 2 blocks away. Initially, John Travers identified himself as James Maloney, however his real identity was revealed. While he was lying in his hospital bed, John Travers would not identify who the shooter was, despite the questioning from the police and the pleads from his mother and the priest. All Travers would say was that he had been drinking and playing a craps game when he was shot by friends. John Travers died in the hospital soon after. In August 1924, Maddie Martin and his wife Anna Lonergan, who had only recently been married, were walking near Sumner Avenue and Quincy Street when 3 men who had been hiding in a doorway attacked them. Anna said she had been hit in the face by one of the men and that Maddie Martin fought them back. After that, one of the men opened fire. Anna was shot in the left hand while Maddie Martin was shot twice in the right arm. This shooting incident led detectives to reopen the unsolved murder case of Wild Bill Lovett, who had been murdered the previous November. Police worked on the theory that a woman was the cause of Wild Bill's death. Bill Lovett and Anna Lonergan had been married just 3 months before his death, while Maddie Martin had married Anna months after Wild Bill's death. Despite the questioning about Bill Lovett's death, Maddie Martin was released without charge. The next time Maddie Martin was mentioned in the papers was in December of 1925 at the funeral of Richard "Peg-leg" Lonergan, the brother of Martin's wife Anna and leader of the White Hand Gang. At the funeral, Maddie Martin and Frank Gurcasino had been threatening reporters who they thought were taking photographs of the funeral and mourners. Police from the gangster squad searched Maddie Martin and found a revolver in his pocket. They were also wanted in connection to a robbery the previous November. Martin was convicted in February 1926 for the gun charge. He received a sentence of between 3 months and 3 years, but he appealed and was brought back to court in March of that year, where he applied to be let out on bail and for the case to be thrown out on reasonable doubt. Martin maintained that the coat he was wearing, that the revolver was found in, was borrowed from someone else. Martin lost his appeal and remained in prison. With Maddie Martin now in prison, the battle for leadership of the gang raged on. It was decided to draw cards for the title of leader. Red Egan pulled the ace of hearts and was dead a minute later. The others accused Egan of palming the high card. The rest of 1926 and most of 1927 seen little to no activity from the White Hand Gang, or at least no activity was prominent in the newspapers. However, by the end of 1927 the gang activity picked up with a shooting and a murder. Eddie Lynch was released from prison in late 1927, having served 5 years in Sing Sing prison for robbery. Eddie Lynch was one of Bill Lovett's men and had introduced Peg-leg Lonergan to Bill Lovett in the early 1920s. It was rumored that Eddie Lynch had double-crossed Peg-leg Lonergan, setting him up to be killed in the Adonis Social Club. It's said he had made a deal with Frankie Yale, telling Yale where Peg-leg Lonergan and his men would be so that Yale and Al Capone could get men into position to perform the hit. However, Eddie Lynch had been in prison since 1922, missing out on all major events in the past few years: Bill Lovett's death in 1923 and Peg-leg Lonergan's in 1925. In early December 1927, Eddie Lynch was drinking in a speakeasy near Fulton Street when the door burst open and a gunman fired 5 shots into the bar, hitting Eddie Lynch and an innocent customer, William Dowling. The gunman escaped in a waiting car. William Dowling, who was an innocent bystander, said that he had the day off work because of the weather, had gone to the speakeasy and was sitting in the back of the bar when he heard 5 shots ring out. He felt a sharp pain in his side and saw Eddie Lynch fall to the floor and crawl to the bar. Dowling made a run outside and found a police officer who rushed to the scene. Police said they believed that Eddie Lynch had been trying to muscle his way back into the rackets recently and that he was one of the old-timers belonged to the Bill Lovett gang, which leads some of the younger gang members fearing and hating him and wanting him out of the way. On the 22nd of December, a mutilated body of a man was found near a construction site by people going to work at 8 a.m. Police said the body of George Monroe, who went by the alias John Martin or John Hayes, was waylaid as he passed by a construction site on Duffield Street. Monroe had his throat cut, almost to the point of being severed, and his clothes were shredded. Police believed that Monroe was another old-timer from the Bill Lovett days. All seemed quiet until April 1928, when Eddie Lynch's body was found with a bullet in his head in an empty lot on Wythe Avenue and Berry Street. Police believed that Eddie Lynch had been killed elsewhere, possibly in a speakeasy or taken for a ride by rival gangsters, and that his body was dumped out of a car into the lot. In May, a number of men gathered on the docks to settle the dispute on who should become the leader of the gang. According to a night watchman near the piers, 4 or 5 men gathered together talking, drinking and rolling dice. Moments later there was gunfire and the men part ways, leaving a body behind. The dead man was Eddie McGuire, who had just rolled a 7 in a game dice to win the prize of leadership of the gang. Eddie McGuire, or Fighting Ed as he was known, was a longtime rival of Maddie Martin, who had been released from prison for his gun charge. The pair had clashed several times over the leadership. It's believed they had settled on a game of dice to settle the dispute. A patrolman who had been a block away and had heard the gunshot, raced to the scene to find the body of Eddie McGuire near the pier where the men had gathered only a short time ago. Eddie McGuire had been shot in the abdomen 3 times. The police investigation revealed that Eddie McGuire and the others had gathered on Pier 3, which was the Columbia Line terminal. They found some empty bottles of alcohol and a full one. The police revealed that the watchman had said he heard arguing and someone shout, "7, I win." There was a brief silence before the gunfire. There were signs of a struggle where McGuire's body lay. The watchman did not give any descriptions of the other men to the police. Within hours though, police arrested 4 men: Maddie Martin, George Red Donnelly, George Gibson and James Clifford. All of the men were questioned and put into a line-up, but all pleaded not guilty and were held without bail. A month later in June, James Red McDonald was shot on Henry Street and Hamilton Avenue while he was talking to a friend. While McDonald was standing there, 3 shots rang out and McDonald was hit once, wounding him just below the heart. Police believed that McDonald was a growing presence among the dock workers and was making a bit of noise, which is what led to him being shot. Upon questioning, McDonald refused to talk, only saying that he would take care of it in his own way. The tensions seemed to have quietened down for the rest of 1928 and 1929. The only time a member of the gang that seems to have come to attention was Thomas Flood. In February 1929 there had been a 48-hour crime wave that culminated in the murder of David Horowitz, a candy store owner from Brooklyn that had been killed in a holdup. Although Thomas Flood was not a suspect in the Horowitz murder, police arrested 125 criminals for various crimes. Thomas Flood was another of the old-timers from the Lovett days, and like Lovett, he had served during World War I, losing an arm in combat. Flood had a criminal record. He had been brought in for questioning for the murder of James Quilty back in 1923, along with Bill Lovett and a few others. Flood was also arrested and charged in 1928 for fighting with a sailor but was released on $500 bail. 1930 started with a bang. Charles Red Donnelly, also known as Bugs Donnelly, was shot to death in a Checkers cabin on the Columbia Line on Pier 3, the same place where Eddie McGuire's body was found in May 1928. Charles Donnelly was another of the old-timers. Donnelly had been arrested along with Wild Bill Lovett in 1919 for the murder of Sammy D'Angelo, which is regarded as Lovett's first murder charge. Donnelly had been brought in many times for questioning in connection to 5 murders and shootings. Each time he beat the case, leading Donnelly to proudly boast that he had gotten the 3rd degree many times and never talked. It was believed that Charles Donnelly had taken over the gang's leadership as the result of a compromise between the warring factions, as they couldn't decide the leadership themselves. This arrangement seemed to hold since the murder of Eddie McGuire in 1928. Charles Donnelly was on the docks on the morning he was killed. He had been overseeing the workers unload freight when someone came to him and said he was wanted down the pier. Donnelly made his way to the checkers booth. When he walked into the booth, 2 shots rang out. When men from the docks ran to the booth, they found Donnelly lying on the ground with a bullet in his head and one in his ear. Although the gunman who shot Donnelly was gone before anyone got to the booth, Maddie Martin was named as the last person seen leaving the booth that day. Maddie Martin and Charles Donnelly had been considered friends. Sources said that Donnelly and Martin's relationship had soured in recent months. They believed that Donnelly was too set in his ways and was happy to continue the old ways of offer protection to people who didn't need it and taking tribute from the dock workers. It was also believed that Maddie Martin wanted to work with a major bootlegger from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, Charles Vanny Higgins. Maddie Martin, Harry Shields, James and Cornelius Clifford along with 5 other men were brought in for the Donnelly murder. However, while those 9 men were in police custody, 2 days after the shooting of Charles Donnelly, another shooting took place in a shack on Atlantic Avenue. James Murray had only been released from Sing Sing prison about 2 weeks previously, having served a 2.5-year sentence for robbery. Witnesses heard shouting and scuffling coming from inside a shack where the Dock Loaders Association held their meetings. Then 2 gunshots rang out. When police arrived, they found James Murray with a bullet in his head, and his head was mutilated from what police believed was a bail hook. When he brought to hospital, it was found he had a fractured skull. 3 men were arrested in that case, including a man named William Banty Hines. In March 1930, another shooting took place. This time it was Bill Simpson who was killed. Bill Simpson was a friend of Charles Red Donnelly who had been murdered the previous January. There were reports that Bill Simpson fought and had beaten 3 men in a fight, including William Banty Hines, John Malley and 1 other man, who were friends of James Murray. It was after that fight that Bill Simpson was shot in the head. It's believed the fight was connected to the murders of Charles Donnelly and James Murray. There was also the added issue of Bill Simpson giving his brother, Whitey Simpson, a job on the docks. Malley and Hines would be freed due to lack of evidence. In June 1930 saw the return of a familiar person, Frank Burns. Frank Burns had been prominent in the days of Bill Lovett. Both Burns and Lovett had a deep hatred towards each other. Frank Burns had spent 7 years in prison for stealing from his employer and had missed out on the gang warfare. However, Frank Burns didn't get in on the action. Frank Burns' body was found floating in the East River in a burlap sack. His hands and feet had been bound together and a bullet in his head. In October, Banty Hines met a bullet while in Manhattan, walking near the Bowery when a gunman opened fire and Hines took a bullet through the kidney. He would survive, however. It wasn't the first time he had been shot, and he had been stabbed a number of times throughout the battle for the docks. For the most part, it now appeared as if Maddie Martin now had the position he had so badly wanted, the undisputed boss of the waterfront. Peace appeared to reign over the docks for the rest of 1930 and into 1931. In December 1931, Maddie Martin finally got his in a shootout in a speakeasy on DeKalb and Hudson Avenue. According to reports, 5 men had been sitting at a table talking about the profits that were to be shared out. Profits had dropped significantly in recent weeks, and this was a cause of tension between the group. At the table was Maddie Martin, Richard Tanner, George Gibson, James Clifford and Thomas Montgomery. As the men argued between themselves, Richard Tanner was said to have pulled a gun and shot Maddie Martin 5 times with 2 bullets lodging in his chest. Martin did manage to pull his gun and had shot Tanner in the arm. The other men began firing, however no one else was hit, despite 24 bullets being fired. Maddie Martin and Richard Tanner were brought to hospital and the other 3 men were arrested for their parts in the shootout. Both Maddie Martin and Richard Tanner refused to cooperate with the police. Maddie Martin died hours later, bringing an end to the war for the control of the Brooklyn docks and waterfront. With the death of Maddie Martin, a bloody saga of killing and revenge killing that lasted almost 20 years, the gang faded away into history. What started with the murder of Chris Maroney by Denny Meehan, ended with the double cross of Maddie Martin. At least 21 murders were committed in the battle for leadership, with many other murders of people caught in the crossfire. Denny Meehan was its longest-serving leader. Bill Lovett ruled with an iron fist. Peg-leg Lonergan was probably its best-known leader. The average lifespan for those who claimed leadership was less than a year. Some reigns of leadership only lasted minutes.